You're listening to the Y4Life podcast with Michelle Baum, Director of Y4Life at Lutherans for Life, where we prepare youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording of our Chats for Life program to find out how you can be live too on our next Youth for Life podcast. Welcome to this recording of Chats for Life. It is so good to be here again. We're doing things a little bit different. We're going to talk about and have a discussion about organ transplant, but I think it might include some other things as well. So I want to welcome my guest, which is our intern, our Y4Life intern, Emma. And Emma, if you want to say hi and introduce yourself, you're certainly welcome to.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I am the Y4Life intern, as Michelle said. I am very excited to have this role with Lutherans for Life and Y4Life, and I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about organ donation with Michelle and ask her some pressing questions that have been on my mind. My grandpa recently has been in the organ transplant process. He was in search of different organs, and so it'll be interesting to see what Michelle has to say about all those kinds of things from a life-affirming, gospel-motivated perspective.
Yeah, and that's what we want to focus on today. What does God's word say? And what can we as Christians who want to make for life decisions, how do we respond to the idea of organ transplant? So just in general, let's just kind of start with this idea, is it right or is it wrong or is it permissible, right, to engage in organ transplant? And we have to say resoundingly, for the most part, yes, that God can use organ transplants and transplants of other body parts from those who have been deceased to uphold and support life. So at its foundation, we see that organ transplant is one of those medical gifts that God has given us that is going to uphold and prolong life from someone who is living, right? And of course, there are some gray areas that I think we're going to explore today. Times when maybe that is not good. But in general, when we look at the medical field, we look at the blessings God has given us through medical doctors and through surgeries that can uphold individuals. So, like for example, I have a relative who broke his heel, and he has another man's heel in his body, right? So they took a heel from a cadaver and placed that in a relative's foot so that that relative could continue to do the things necessary in life to sustain a living, to support his family, to serve others, right? So that transplant of not necessarily an organ, but a body part, a bone, has enabled him to carry on the vocations that God has given him, right? So as we talk about those vocations, so as we talk about organ transplants in general, what sort of questions do you have, Emma?
In research I've done as leading up to my grandpa's possible procedures and things like that, I've kind of noticed that there's a debate on what dead means from a Christian perspective. When does death happen?
Yeah, that is a great question, right? And I know that the LCMS has a CTCR document that addresses this, and pastors talk about this, especially, and it's really important to have pastors present when families are going through end-of-life decisions and trying to determine next steps. So officially, death is biblically the end of life, but also the separation of the body and from the soul. So we know that when death happens, the soul leaves the body and goes to heaven, and officially death happens then. But the problem is we don't know the exact moment when that happens, right? There's no like red light that goes off or buzzer like, oh, everything's over, right? The soul has moved on. And so as Christians, we're very careful to leave that moment of death in God's hands. We recognize that, given, again, we don't know the exact minute, the exact second when that happens, but we recognize that the dying process does involve a cleaving, a separation of body and soul. And that is part of the mystery of life and part of the mystery of death, that God creates us, that he weaves us together in a way that is beautiful and cannot be understood, just as we know death is something to be mourned because it is a rendering of that wovenness, right? A tearing apart of the body and soul that was meant to be together forever. But because of sin, obviously that cannot happen. Our body is good, and our body will be reunited with our soul, and our body will be made new. But that passing into death is one of God's mysteries. So that makes it, again, very difficult in the medical field, and as Christians to know, okay, when has death happened? And we would say, I mean, there are some signs, obviously, when death has happened, when the brain waves, when the brain has died, right? When the brain stops communicating with the rest of the body, but also when the heart stops beating and the lungs stop taking in breath. So there's various elements that we're waiting for to happen, and then we, officially can say, all right, death has happened, and what is visible, what we can see, determines then that God has done his work to take that individual to be with him in heaven, right? So again, exact moment, exact second, we can't say, but we do know that there's kind of that trifecta, right, of things that cease to happen in a body, in a human being, that we would conclude then that the person has died.
Yeah, I only bring up that question first because it's very important when determining the ethical position of organ donation. Some organs can be given from live, totally living people, when it comes to like kidneys or livers. I mean, the liver itself is completely amazing. God has done a lot of cool things when it comes to the liver. I mean, you can cut off a piece of one person's liver, put it in someone else's body, and they both regrow. Like
Yeah,
how is that possible? God
yeah.
has he's so good. But then other things like some of the bigger organs like hearts and lungs and all those kinds of things, their transplant or their donor status is determined based on the dead or living status of the person giving of their lungs
Mm.
or their heart, depending on which, some of those different organs. So that's why I started there.
Yeah. And I think it's important to start there. What is the definition of death? Because it isn't just brain dead, right? So that's going to shape how we see some organ transplants. So like you said, some organs can be transplanted without the ending of a person's life. But then there are some organs that in the transplant process will actually end the person's life. So most organs can be transplanted after death has happened. Like, again, you mentioned the heart as one of those things, and the heart would be an exception. Okay, so the heart actually has to be beating when it is transplanted. So when we go back to those three things that mark death, right? The cessation of breathing, the end of brain waves or brain action, and the end of the beating of the heart, we're missing one, right? So that when we look at organ donations, that's one that as Christians should raise a red flag for us. If we truly believe that God is the giver and taker of life, that he determines, as Psalm 139 mentions, the book of our life, right? The beginning and the end. Then if we are taking a heart out of someone while it's still beating, we are hastening death. And that's something that as Christians, should cause concern, right? There are lots of things that can be, again, transplanted, dead or still living. But in general, most organs, they're going to wait until a person has passed away. For example, the eyes, right? Or some of the other things, some of the other organs that might be useful. Like again, in the case of even the bone structures that might be able to help others, those are going to be removed after a person has passed away. But those things that are removed while they're living still, that should create concern for us, and really is not in accordance with what God desires for our life.
And I think it's a little bit hard in this day and age because there's such a great need for different uh, organs. The organ transplant list is just so long, and we want to uphold their lives and help them to, fulfill their vocations and make them feel better and all those kinds of things. But the medical field in that process seems to have created a little bit of an issue. In wanting to find more donors, they have created an issue for Christians, I think, and how they define death, because there's, you know, the situation of a heart transplant, they say that's good. But as Christians, we're like, hold up, you're ending someone else's life. Um, and I think it's hard to wrap our brains around, because
Yeah.
we want to keep our loved ones alive. We want them to be with us, but
Yeah. At what cost, right?
right.
And I
Yeah.
think it's good then to take a step back and look at life as a gift, right? We are only given life as a gift from God, and God determines the beginning of that gift and the end of that gift. We don't have a right to extend our life, right? We are not our own gods. And so that's where medicine and organ donation can certainly uphold life, right? But when it comes to the point that we are determining, or we are declaring that this life will go on, is probably a step too far, right? Ultimately, God makes that decision. And it is hard. You're right. We do love our loved ones. We want them to live. We want them to live forever. And God wants us to live forever too. But because of sin, we will die. And actually, just as he does in life, with bad things that happen to us, God uses them for good. And so as Christians, we have hope, even when our loved one passed away. We know that God is going to use this for good, that he is going to, through death, bring that individual to him in heaven and give him life eternal, right? That same life eternal promise that was given, and actually gift that was given in baptism, the same promise we hear throughout scriptures. And so it is very easy to fall prey to, we want to extend life as long as we can because this is the only thing, right? The only thing we have to look forward to. And that really is the world's view. I mean,
Mhm.
the world's view is when life ends, there is no hope. But we Christians can say, you know what, if we can help someone live even a better life, if we can extend their days and by assisting them in this way without ending another person's life, then that is a gift from God. But we don't have the right to end another life in order to make someone else live longer, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is hard. It is hard because we grieve. We don't want them to live this life. But that also is part of the brokenness in us, right? Ben Jonson, he is a poet, an older poet. He wrote a poem called On My First Son, and his first son was named after him. And it's really a beautiful eulogy that talks about that he mourns the loss of his son and he will miss him. But and his son was only 7 when he died. But he says, you were lent to me for 7 years, and now God has taken you back. And I think that that is such a wonderful way of viewing the gift of life, right? That God gives us as a gift to others for a time, and eventually we will get to see that individual again, right? So in many ways, that is an eternal gift that God gives. When God creates a human being, that human being will live forever. And we hope, because of the message of the gospel, that human being will live with us in heaven forever. That's the goal, right? But that life forever won't happen in the here and now. And it's important to remember that gift, that eternity, can only be realized after death or Jesus' second coming. I mean, that's a great way to solve the problem
Yeah.
too. So yeah.
Yeah, Christians have a cool perspective that unfortunately the world doesn't have. But I guess that's also our job as Christians to spread the hope that we have
Right.
and bring others into it.
Right. We
And
don't have to go ahead.
it's
Sorry.
especially useful in times troubles, especially when it comes to death. I think the hope of life to come, and that this is just they're just sleeping. They aren't
Right.
actually gone. We will see them
Right.
again.
We will see them again, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have to clamor for more days at the expense of someone else's life. We can uphold a life, but we don't have to, but we can also rejoice and mourn in the work that God does to take that person to be with him in heaven.
I With a transplant list so large, there's a lot of people who will never receive one. How can we uphold their lives?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think, very, very personal to both of us at different times in our life. And I think one of the ways we uphold their lives is to help them to recognize that each day is a gift, right? Um, we can't mandate how long we will live, but each day is a gift. And to do whatever we can to keep them comfortable, to make them comfortable, and to help them to continue to be part of gatherings and part of our lives. To remind them that they aren't alone, to remind them that not only is God with them, which is very, very important, that God is working through this suffering to make them a confession to others, but also God is strengthening their faith and readying them for heaven, but also that they are not alone, that we want to be with them, right? So to include them in those family gatherings, to include them in our prayers. There is a loneliness epidemic that's happening in America, and it's not just youth that are lonely. We see this in the elderly. We see this even in the middle-aged, right? So we serve them where they need to be served. So that may make it impossible for them to travel to us. And so we do what we can to travel to them. Perhaps we help them set up the Zoom on their computer so that we can see them face to face as close as we can get on Zoom, or FaceTime or whatever it is that we want to use, so that we don't have to feel, they don't have to feel alone. So.
Yeah. And then I guess finally, one of my last questions is how, as a potential donor, as we're still alive and have this choice, what can we do as Christians to uh, uphold our own lives, I guess, and the lives of others without uh, overstepping our God's boundaries
Yeah.
on these things.
That's a great question because, I think, once you become 16 and you have that driver's license, you get to determine on the back of your driver's license, at least in most states, you get to indicate whether you're going to be a donor or you just record it as you get your driver's license. And so first of all, obviously we're going to recognize that our body is a good gift. Our body is a good gift. And we want to uphold the gift of the body. It is not a shell that we want to escape. It is not something that we just have to be trapped in. Actually, the body is in the flesh very, very good. And so we want to use our body for good things. And it is, if the Holy Spirit so moves you, a good and godly desire to want to help others even after we die. We know that God can and will remake our bodies no matter where our body parts are, whether they are in the coffin with us or whether they are in someone else's body or have been buried somewhere else. God can put things back together, and He will. And so we don't have to worry about that. It is also good and godly to say, I really just want to be buried with these body parts, and that's okay too. But I think if we do decide that we want to be organ donors, it's very important to make clear what organs are permissible to donate. So for example, I've had the discussion with my husband who, hopefully it won't happen anytime soon, but when I pass away, if he's still alive, he knows, and will advocate for not using the heart, right? Because the heart, that transplant ends lives, would end my life. And I do want my death to be a confession of Christ, right? I want my death to be something that God does, that a man doesn't hasten. And of course, if somebody who's listening, that's happened and they didn't really realize that this was the case, they didn't realize that heart donation would end another person's life, there is grace and mercy and forgiveness for that too. And so, this is not going to keep us out of heaven, but knowing that it ends a life, we just want to make that very clear, right? We want to make a confession for God, even in our passing, to our family members, to the doctors and nurses who will be present and maybe awaiting our death to harvest some of those organs, and that is a good confession. That is a faithful confession. So, making that known. If you're going to, as a young person, put it on your license, then make your parents known, or don't put it on your license, and just make it known to your parents that you would be open to that, or you wouldn't, but you would be open to that with this exception, right? And I think having those conversations before they're necessary, right, is a good idea. It's a good idea, just like it's a good idea to plan your funeral before you die,
Yeah.
to make the confession for God. It's okay to talk about death before it happens, to be ready to make that confession and to help the people around you to make the confession that your body and life were gifts, and that life is important.
I think having your families or your significant other advocating for you helps you kind of get around some of those gray areas too.
Yeah.
You can avoid them a lot easier once get on the official donor list through your driver's license or whatnot. It becomes a lot harder because that kind of trumps a lot of other things. That's what you said you wanted, what your family thinks may not fly in the hospital at that time, even if things. Your family is a better advocate than a little heart on your license.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, your family can advocate for yeah, your wishes very well, and has the right to do so, right? Yep, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think the other person you bring in, to advocate for you is your pastor. Pastors are important in those last moments. They're important. It's important that they're there, or that they've spoken with the family to uphold life and to make sure that the family is comforted, that you are receiving the care, the spiritual care that you need. But also, we don't know, for example, if someone's in a coma, we don't know how much is heard and how much is understood. But we do know, and my husband's a pastor, and he can attest to this, that, praying and singing hymns around the bedside of someone who is dying is comforting, not only to the families and a witness to the nurses and the doctors that are there, but also sometimes there is recognition when people come out of those comas, or when people do rally for another day or two. There is comfort there for the person who's dying.
Faith comes by hearing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Whether spoken or sung, right?
Right. Yep.
So that's good. Any other questions you have?
I think we kind of hit all of my big questions. This is all very helpful and giving some insight on the different life issues that aren't necessarily the big ones we always talk about. I've had people say organ transplants, organ donation, that's a life issue. It's like, yeah, it really is. So I think it was good that we were able to touch on it a little bit today and get some questions answered.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me, Emma. And for those of you who are listening, thanks for joining us. We hope that you like and share the podcast. And we hope also that if you have questions, you'll check out Y4Life.org or Lutheransforlife.org for follow-up information. We'll actually be putting a brochure out about organ donation fairly soon. My guess is it'll be out by the time this podcast ends up being published. So check that out. And thank you for your gospel-motivated voice for life. Thanks for joining us for today's life topic. Check out Y4Life.org or email Michelle at Y4Life.org to find out how and when you can go live with us at our next Chats for Life session. Or join us next time right here at Y4Life Podcasts, where youth learn how to be gospel-motivated voices for life.